The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the sprawling vineyard, the rows of grapevines swaying lazily in the warm breeze. Daniel Carter wiped the sweat from his brow, leaning against a wooden post as he surveyed the landscape. This place had been his sanctuary, a retreat from the complexities of life, but today it felt different, charged with an undercurrent he couldn't name. The crunch of footsteps against gravel disrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Sophie Miller, his young neighbor, weaving through the vines with effortless grace. Dressed in a flowing sundress that caught the wind, she carried an air of carefree confidence that contrasted sharply with the restraint Daniel had spent years perfecting. "You work too hard," Sophie teased, stopping just a few feet away. Her voice was light, playful, but her gaze held something deeper, a curiosity laced with something else, something unspoken. Daniel forced a smile, keeping his tone measured. "Someone has to." She tilted her head. "And you think that someone always has to be you?" He exhaled, turning back to his work. Conversations with Sophie always felt like standing at the edge of something dangerous, thrilling but reckless. Sophie wandered closer, trailing her fingers along the vines as she spoke. "I've always loved it here. It feels different from the rest of the world." "It is," Daniel admitted, though he wasn't sure if he meant the vineyard or the moment itself. She crouched beside a vine, examining a cluster of grapes. "Show me something," she said suddenly. Daniel hesitated. "What do you mean?" "Teach me," she pressed, kneeling down, looking up at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. "How do you know when the grapes are ready?" For a second, he considered an excuse to walk away, to put distance between them before the tension became too heavy. But she was watching him with an intensity that made retreat impossible. He knelt beside her, deliberately keeping his movements slow. "You look for color," he said, reaching for a grape. "And texture. The skin should be firm but give just a little." Sophie's eyes followed his hand, but she didn't take the grape. Instead, she reached out, her fingers barely brushing his wrist. A simple touch, yet it sent a current through him, unexpected and unwelcome. Daniel swallowed hard. This was a mistake. "You feel it, don't you?" Sophie murmured. His breath caught. "Sophie." A distant sound, perhaps the wind, perhaps something else, shattered the moment. Daniel jerked back, standing abruptly. His pulse pounded against his ribs as if he had done something unforgivable. Sophie rose slowly, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "Relax, Daniel. I just wanted to learn." But her eyes betrayed her. She knew exactly what she was doing. Daniel took a step back, his voice steadier than he felt. "It's getting late." Sophie studied him for a lingering moment before nodding. "I suppose it is." As she walked away, Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had always thought of temptation as something loud, something obvious. But here, in the quiet of his vineyard, it had arrived as a whisper, a touch, a look, a moment too long. And he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to ignore it. The early morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and ripening fruit. Daniel stood at the edge of his vineyard, hands in his pockets, staring at the place where Sophie had knelt the evening before. The ground still bore the faintest indentation, a whisper of her presence that refused to be erased. He had spent the night trying to forget, telling himself that it had been nothing, that she had meant nothing by it. But the way she had looked at him, the way her voice had dropped to a murmur that curled around his senses, that was not nothing. A soft chime pulled him from his thoughts. He reached for his phone. "Emily, we still on for dinner tonight?" Guilt settled in his stomach like a stone. Emily. His wife, his anchor, the woman who had built a life with him. They had been married for 10 years, steady years, predictable years. Years without fire. Shaking the thought away, he typed a quick response. Course. Looking forward to it. He would forget Sophie's touch. He would draw a line between them and never cross it. But some lines are easier to imagine than to enforce. "Morning, stranger." Daniel stiffened. He hadn't heard her approach, but there she was, Sophie Miller, standing at the fence line, arms folded, a playful smirk tugging at her lips. "You're up early," he said, keeping his tone neutral. A shrug. "Could say the same about you." He didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the vines, hoping she would take the hint. He didn't. Sophie leaned against the wooden post, watching him. "So, are we pretending last night didn't happen?" Daniel's fingers tightened around a vine. "Nothing happened." Her laughter was soft, almost pitying. "That's one way to look at it." He exhaled slowly. "Sophie, whatever this is, it stops now." She tilted her head. "And what exactly is this?" He turned to face her, forcing himself to meet her gaze without faltering. "A mistake." For a second, something flickered in her eyes, something that looked almost like hurt. But then it was gone, replaced by that same teasing confidence. "Relax, Daniel," she said, pushing off the post. "I was just being friendly." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Unless you wanted it to be something else." Daniel held his ground, but inside something wavered. He could feel the pull of her presence, the weight of unspoken possibilities pressing against the space between them. But then a car door slammed. Emily's voice drifted through the vineyard. "Daniel." Sophie's smirk widened, but she stepped back just as Emily came into view. "Morning, Emily," Sophie called, her voice bright, innocent. Emily smiled politely. "Sophie, what brings you by?" "Oh, just admiring Daniel's hard work," Sophie said smoothly. She turned back to Daniel, her eyes glinting with amusement. "Always a pleasure." With that, she walked away, leaving the scent of wildflowers and something far more dangerous in her wake. Emily moved beside him, watching Sophie disappear down the road. "She's spirited," she said carefully. Daniel forced a chuckle. "That's one word for it." Emily turned to him then, studying him with the quiet perceptiveness that had once drawn him to her. "Are you okay?" she asked. And for the first time in years, Daniel wasn't sure how to answer. The dining room was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, the flickering flames casting elongated shadows across the walls. The scent of rosemary and garlic lingered in the air, mingling with the rich aroma of red wine. Emily had gone all out for dinner. Handmade pasta, a perfectly seared roast, a bottle of their best vintage. Daniel sat at the head of the table, swirling the wine in his glass, watching the liquid catch the light. He should have been fully present, immersed in the warmth of home, in the comfort of his wife's company. Instead, his thoughts wandered to sun-kissed skin, to the hushed whisper of his name beneath the vines, to the way Sophie had looked at him that morning as if she knew he was already unraveling. Emily sat across from him, her expression calm, composed, but her eyes were searching. He could feel it. She had always been able to read him, even when he didn't want to be read. "You've been distracted lately," she said finally, breaking the silence between them. Daniel set his glass down carefully, considering his response. "Just busy. The harvest is coming soon." Emily nodded, but her gaze didn't waver. "I know when something is on your mind." His grip on the stem of his glass tightened. Lie or tell a truth so watered down it no longer held weight. "I guess I've just been restless," he admitted. Emily exhaled, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. "Get it. We've been in the same rhythm for years now. Maybe we need something different." For a brief moment, he thought she was speaking of the same kind of different that had been haunting him. But then she reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Maybe we should take a trip. Get away for a bit." Just as he should have jumped at the idea. Should have latched onto it as a lifeline, a chance to sever the dangerous thread weaving itself between him and Sophie. Instead, his mind betrayed him. Would Sophie miss him if he was gone? Would she wait for him to return? He pulled his hand back, not unkindly, but enough for Emily to notice. A shadow flickered across her face, though she didn't comment on it. They ate in silence after that, the clink of silverware against porcelain the only sound between them. Later that night, Daniel stood by the open window of their bedroom, the cool night air brushing against his skin. The house was quiet, Emily already in bed, her breathing steady and even. He should have joined her. Should have wrapped himself in the life they had built and let everything else fade. Instead he reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen. He had no reason to text Sophie. No justification beyond the gnawing pull in his chest. But before he could make a choice, his phone vibrated in his palm. Message. From her. Still awake. Daniel closed his eyes. He was already past the point of no return.